Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I trust that you all enjoyed your lunch. So I'll be presenting my paper, A Novel Framework for the Development of Age-Appropriate Information Security Serious Games. Quite a mouthful. My co-author helped me with the psychology. I'm not an expert in that field, so I needed a bit of help there. So what I'm going to talk about is information security serious games, then the need for a framework to aid in the development of age-appropriate serious games. Then I'm going to discuss the framework, how I tested the framework, or more accurately, verified that it's feasible, and then just present my conclusions. So firstly, what is a serious game? So a serious game is quite simply any game that has a stronger focus on teaching or education than on amusement. Now, if you read through the literature, there are various different approaches and opinions on when is it a serious game or when is it an information game. But for simplicity, we're looking in general terms at any game that focuses on teaching or education. It does not mean that it can't be amusing. It just means that the focus is on teaching various topics. So within the context of information security and actually quite a few fields, it's proven very effective at improving education courses, and it has been shown to be effective for information security concepts. There's old security games that I reference in the paper as well that have been in service at corporations for years by this stage, and they are continuing. They see continuous use because they prove to be effective. So these are a couple of the games that I reference in the paper. So the focus of this table is to highlight some of the topics that are covered in the game. So CyberKids, for example, focuses on strong passwords and vulnerability identification. And if you look at all of these games, you'll see that the focus of the game, the topics that it covers, connects to the game's focus. So I'll get into that a little bit later on. It's very interesting how these existing games already match into some of the topics included in the framework as well. So while serious games are very effective at teaching, there are some catches. And these catches, to illustrate them, I'm quoting Douglas Adams's rules for the relationship that people have with technology. Anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary, and just a natural part of the way the world works. This fits into what our keynote speaker also mentioned yesterday, is you have your two ways of thinking about a topic or approaching a problem. There's your natural instinctive way and your more rational way. And if you're born into a world that has mobile phones and the internet, you're just going to assume that your way of thinking is going to assume that those things have always been there. Then the second rule, anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you could probably get a career in it. And then finally, anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. Now, Douglas Adams rather satirically used this as part of an essay, or included it in an essay, which basically focused on, don't worry about the internet, just adapt, get used to it. So he argued that if you take these three rules and you look at how you interact with technology yourself, you can figure out how old you are based on these three rules. So this ties into how you as a person develop through various phases of your life. So this is Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. You go through each of these phases throughout the course of your life. So in infancy, toddlerhood, preschool, childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. Additionally, each of these phases, or most of these phases, can be matched to various stages of neurological development as well. And that's why there's such a big difference between many of these stages. Now, for infancy, where you have to figure out trust and mistrust, and then anatomy and shame in toddlerhood, all the way down to integrity and despair in late adulthood. These are various things that are important to you as you develop throughout your life. Now, in particular, for this framework, we're focusing on childhood, specifically from toddlerhood, from preschool to adolescence. And the reason for this is connected to the challenges that you have to face during that phase of your life. So an infant needs to develop trust in caretakers in the world. Toddlers have to realize that they have the ability to make decisions. But now when you get to preschool, now you have to try out new things. You have to start experimenting, and you have to learn how to handle failure. With childhood, you need to learn basic skills. And with adolescence, you need to develop a lasting integrated sense of self. And also you need to develop your own understanding of the world. You need to figure out how to interpret what you learn from your knowledge and your experiences. So these three phases are ideally suited within a framework like this to inform how you should build a security game. The other thing is, if you look at all of these different phases, there is a stark difference between adults and children. So there's this idea that we have, which is based in our observations, is that you have children, then you have teenagers, and then you have adults. And the three groups are clearly distinguishable from each other because they think in different ways. Now, this is tied to neurological development throughout your life. So how do you learn in each of these stages? So while the development of you as a person throughout your life can be observed using the phases of development, when you actually learn specific skills and knowledge, you go through 4 phases, which was highlighted by Bandura in his social cognitive theory. Firstly, you see what you need to learn. You have your attention. Then you observe the knowledge. So you identify what you have to remember. You try to reproduce it. And then you have motivation for using that knowledge in practice. So how this works typically in a game is let's use a very simple example. Most tutorial levels in games, those of you who are familiar with games, you have a skill that is introduced. It's shown to you. Then you have to remember how that skill is used, reproduce it in your tutorial area, and then you're motivated later on in the game to use those skills that you've learned to solve problems in the game world. So this broad cycle of attention, retention, reproduction, motivation is found in most game actions where you have to use a skill and where you have to solve problems. Now, to get to the point for why we actually need a framework like this, we've already discussed that people go through various different neurological and psychological development stages throughout their lives. This means that if you are an adult and you don't have the experience of dealing with children, for example, parents have an advantage. They know how children think. They see how children develop. But say, for example, you're a developer, you want to develop serious games for children, then you're going to need a bit of help because you don't necessarily have the expertise to know how to design the game, what topics to focus on, difficulty levels, all those types of things. So it's tied directly into the fact that children and adults don't think or learn in the same way. Then a serious game for adults might not be effective for teaching children. It's possible that it might be, but it's more plausible that if you build a corporate information security serious game and give it for children, preschoolers, for instance, they're going to be completely lost and not know how to use know how to play the game, and they won't get a lot of value out of it. And then the crux of the whole focus, if we can get more information security serious games developed, especially those targeting children at a younger age, the idea ideal is that by helping those children develop security culture and safe behavior early on in life, it's going to be a positive impact when they enter the workforce in future. So all of these things, these habits, the culture that we have, a password it's too much of a bother to use a secure password for every site. By developing those habits at an early age, the people that enter the workforce, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, or actually more like 15 years from now, should have those habits in place, which will make addressing the issues of information security behavior might be a little easier to address that. Now, here is the framework that was developed. So the framework was developed by firstly looking at Ericsson stages. So the third, fourth, and fifth stage was selected for the framework. And the focus of what you should develop during that stage when it comes to information security was identified, say, for instance, with your third stage, you introduce fundamental concepts, how to handle failure, and that underlying idea of why should you care about information security or cybersecurity. With your fourth stage, core skills such as how to generate passwords or to create passwords, what is the difference between a password and a passphrase, what's safe behavior, and then with adolescents, starting to understand why, identify various threats, and figure out perhaps countermeasures, identify risky behavior in your own life, and try to see if there's a reason for that. And then, of course, develop a sense of value for information security concepts. Again, when you're focusing on a child and you tell them it costs a lot of money when you have data breaches, that might not be as impactful as when you introduce that for an adolescent, say, for example. And then we have our gameplay cycle in which these skills are introduced. Now, as discussed earlier, this is based both on what is observed in game design theory as well as social cognitive theory. So you introduce a new skill or a piece of knowledge, you test that skill or knowledge, then you challenge that skill or knowledge, and then you integrate it into a wider process. So let's say, for example, you have to, you introduce the skills you need to create a secure password. Then you test those skills in a fairly simple way. You challenge those skills with a difficult problem, and then you integrate it as part of a toolkit, say, for example, that you as player can then use in the game world in order to solve problems or multifaceted problems. So this gameplay cycle then repeats, and all of your old skills are taken over and used as existing skills when you get new ones in order to build up a greater skill set. Now, in order to test this framework, what I did was I looked for information security serious games that specifically targeted one of the three stages. Now, one of the collections of games that I found targets more than one of these stages, so I focused on one or two of the games in that set. Then the serious games are evaluated based on the topics that were identified. So those would be core skills or fundamental concepts, things like those. And then finally, the framework and the game were matched. And what was especially gratifying for me is when I did this is how cleanly at least one set of games matched the concepts of the framework. Now, this was specifically with the third stage. Now, at last year's HAISA conference, these games were presented. This is incidentally the background for why I thought of this framework was during last year's presentation of this paper, I wondered, is there perhaps a framework that could make it a little easier to develop games like these for people that don't necessarily have children, but have the development expertise. So with the Wolf, Hyena, and Fox games, as well as the Happy Hippo game, the framework actually matched the games very well, or more accurately, the games match the framework very well. The game targets the third stage, so it introduces fundamental concepts, things like password complexity and good online behavior. One of these games focuses on what online bullying is and how you should handle that. So those types of concepts are introduced. And then the structure of the game cycle, it goes through iterative steps, and it deals very nicely with, you use one skill, test it, challenge it, and integrate it into your largest tool set. Then for the fourth stage, which is the PBS Cybersecurity Lab, this was aimed at school children, which matches the fourth stage, and it focuses on developing skills such as coding and password cracking. There are other skills as well. I highlight these specifically because they're the easiest to highlight as an information security skill. There is a strong focus on teacher input here, but again, the basic game cycle matches the framework. So here, the PBS Cybersecurity Lab isn't a perfect fit for the game cycle, but the overall process, introduce a skill, test it, challenge it, integrate it into your toolkit, it's still there. It just requires an additional step, which is you need some teacher input. Then for the fifth stage, I looked at a set of 6 games, which is published in one paper. See, I forgot to add the reference there. As one would expect for a set of games that focuses on adolescence all the way up to young adulthood, which is what these games target, there's a greater focus on comprehension and understanding in these games. And each of the games focuses on a specific skill. So this is where the framework was not a perfect fit for these 6 games. The game cycle focuses on multiple skills, whereas in this case, each game introduced a skill, and then it was tested and challenged and honed over multiple cycles. So in a way, the cycle is still there, but it's not a multi-skill cycle as presented in the framework. So my conclusion based on these results was that while there were slight deviations from the framework, in most cases, there was almost a perfect fit with some of the games and a mostly perfect fit from the other games. So this supports the idea that if the framework had existed when the development of these games started, that the framework could have been used to inform the development of those games. Now, this is my argument for why the framework is at least feasible, so valid within the context of game development. Now, this, of course, brings us to our limitations of the study. So firstly, a small number of games were evaluated to test the framework. And the biggest shortcoming is that the framework has not yet been used to develop an actual serious game. This is part of planned future research projects, perhaps master's or PhD projects, where they can take the framework and develop specific games and then test those games in the real world and see if the framework holds water. So in conclusion, this was a framework that is based on well-known psychological principles, Erikson's social cognitive theory and Bandura. These are known and, as I understand it, respected theories within cognitive psychology and developmental psychology. It matches existing serious games. And based on this, it should be possible to use this framework to develop age-appropriate serious games for teaching information security concepts that are effective components of teaching young children. And this could then be expanded outside of formal courses, such as school courses. And if the games are developed in the correct way, and they should be available to a wider audience, which should help overall information security culture in future. And that was my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't bore you.